So first of all, I just want to start off welcoming everyone to our budgeting seminar or webinar that's hosted by the Committee on the Academy. And it's part of a series of webinars that we're going to be hosting between now and leading up to the Administrators Conference. And while we do say it's part of the chair's conference, it's also for anybody who is interested in learning more about their budget. My name is Cherie Smith, and I am the privilege of being the chair for the Committee on the Academy for this year. And so we're really excited to be able to host this. This webinar is going to be moderated by Carissa Slaughterback. She is a member of the Committee on the Academy. And we will start out with some introductory remarks by Provost Pfizer from Oregon State, as well as the rest of the panel. As you know, this webinar will be recorded and will be put on the ACSP website, followed by an unrecorded quick Q&A. And the idea is that you'll always be able to access this information as you need it or as future questions arise. With that, I would like to introduce Provost Pfizer. No introduction needed. Hopefully everyone knows him, and I will give it to you.
Thanks, Cherie, and thanks for having me today. I'm glad to talk about budgeting, everyone's favorite topic. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm a provost here at Oregon State University and had been a department head in planning and a dean of fine and applied arts, both at Illinois. The College of Fine and Applied Arts, I think a bit relevant to our conversation, includes both visual and performing arts, as well as architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. So a lot of different kinds of units requiring different kinds of subsidies. I was then interim provost of Illinois during their budget crisis period and before I came to OSU. And I've started budget reform at Illinois that led to their current model. I started that during the crisis and then implemented RCM here at OSU, although the RCM here had been in development prior to my arrival. I'm not necessarily a, dyed-in-the-wool RCM person, but just worked for Oregon State. I think there are pros and cons to these different models, and we'll probably talk about that as we go along. So here are just some comments. I don't want to talk too long because we want to get into a dialogue, but I want to just give you some framing thoughts, and it might help you as new department heads or continuing department heads in terms of how you think about budgeting. The first thing I think you need to think about is just really understanding the context. I've found over the many years of doing this that education is about budgeting is half the battle. So it's hard to underestimate or overestimate how little your faculty often know about how budgeting works within the university. And it's good to have a context in terms of the larger higher education landscape and educating why we are where we are, especially if you're in a public institution. As you probably know, higher education is one of the larger discretionary components in state budgets. It is effectively, because of the nature of other components, often the balancing wheel in the budget. That's because so many other categories are either baked in or they have, frankly, more political support across most states. And this includes K-12, Medicaid, in prisons, sometimes people call the 3 Ps, pre-K-12, prisons, and pensions. Those things will often crowd out other categories of spending, and higher education is one of those discretionary categories that often comes out at the low end. The state legislators also are aware that you can resolve that or manage that problem by increasing tuition. And that's, of course, what many states have done as spending's gone up or costs have gone up in other categories and they haven't been able to keep pace. Often tuition increases are what universities do to fall back and meet their costs. Other things going on in the background, of course, funded research. Many faculty don't realize funded research, if you value it correctly in direct terms, actually loses money for the institution. That's in direct terms. As research, many research universities, it's of course part of your mission. There are many indirect benefits, but if you value it correctly, and often your faculty are under the assumption that funded research is a source of net revenue for the institution, and that's actually not true in a direct sense. And what I mean by direct indirect is indirectly research has a big impact because it's part of your mission, and it affects your reputation and your support and other things. So it's not as if research isn't valuable. It's just that you can fall into the trap of imagining that it itself is a net revenue generator. Of course, costs continue to escalate. I won't go into long detail here, but I often talk in settings like this about partial myths, and these are things that I think of as partly true, partly untrue. Things like administrative bloat, the fact that faculty aren't teaching enough in some units and in some colleges, the student debt crisis, weakening return to ROI on degrees, galloping costs, research as a revenue source, as I mentioned, and higher education as a private good. All those things are partly true. I'm not going to go into detail. We could talk about them in conversation, and they're partly untrue, but they shape a lot of the dialogue and conversation among your faculty. And so it's just good to be educated about them. Remember, there's a pretty good generational bias on your faculties, especially for your older faculty. This is changing. I used to be able to say this 10 years ago and everybody would nod, but now everybody's aging out a bit. But if you think about your most senior faculty, many of them came of age as scholars during kind of a golden era of public university spending. And they tend to think that those days are simply around the corner if we just make some decisions differently. And in fact, that was kind of an unusual period post-war to about the mid-70s expansion of public universities in the United States, driven heavily by the GI Bill and growth in the states and demographics that drove growth. If you look at the long history of higher education, it's generally been a challenging financial one. I mean, that's the history. So the experience you're having as heads, and I've always had, in fact, I don't think out of many years of my being a head and a dean and a provost, I've spent most of my time finding ways to creatively reduce budgets. I mean, very few years I've had where the budget actually went up in a significant way. So, that's kind of the era we're in. But it isn't a totally atypical one when you look at the long run of higher education. We're in an era of slow rising growth given demographics. The pandemic introduced additional challenges, especially with regard to international enrollment that are likely to stick. And we have rising competition, and the student is more and more the driver as a consumer. And this is really forcing us to think differently about how we manage digital education, unbundling of degrees, alternative credentials, repackaging and remarketing of degrees. We're probably headed toward a world where we do more competency-based learning. All these things are introducing change, and universities are not very good at change. And I say that that last point because I try to remind everyone we're not good at change for a really good reason. That is, when we're thinking about innovation, we mainly want to innovate in our teaching and research, and energy to innovate is actually a limited commodity. You don't have an unlimited supply of it, and your faculty are focused on doing interesting, creative, innovative things in their teaching and in their research. They don't want to innovate around the administration. They don't want to innovate around the organization. And so we're sort of in this weird situation where we need to be more innovative as organizations, but it's not really the first priority of your faculty, and it probably shouldn't be. So that makes your job particularly challenging. But the reason that's relevant here is that's what's really putting the pressure on a shift from incremental budgeting to RCM-like budgeting, because RCM gives you an additional tool. I'll talk about what I mean by that for those of you not that familiar with the term, but basically, administrations need to drive change, and they have a couple of ways to do that. And one of those ways is in the context of shared governance, where faculty have a lot of control over where the organization goes, and appropriately so. You can plead, you can try to rally the troops. You can inspire. Those are all important. But I think, as a lot of administrators have learned, particularly in large institutions, very complex institutions, you need incentives that help drive things. And that's the appeal of the RCM type model, which actually goes back to float on your own bottom models of some of the oldest private institutions like Harvard and others, where colleges really did kind of stand alone and they could grow or decline. So that's kind of an interesting history there. Different kind of models out there is really basically two, probably bigger budget experts than me would take issue with this, but incremental, year on year kind of budgeting is very common, still out there, and then RCM, or responsibility center management. And the responsibility center varies. In a lot of contexts, the responsibility center is the college. And what that means is the university is going to direct resources and allocate costs to the college level, and the college is then going to have the discretion to allocate costs below the level of the college. This sort of distinction between how a particular budget model propagates is often a confusing point to faculty as well. They imagine when the university has an RCM budget model that it's actually pushing resources all the way down from the top of the overall university into the college and down into the unit. And I've seen many deans fall into the trap of imagining that their role is to propagate that model through. And for a variety of reasons, and especially for units you all are often associated with, that is very difficult to do. I can tell you I had a run at it at Illinois and I decided it was nuts. So there was no way we could, in my College of Fine and Applied Arts with music, theater, dance, School of Art and Design, School of Architecture, Landscape Architecture, City Planning, a Performing Arts Center, and a museum, figure out how to algorithmically allocate the budget. And so we had an RCM model from the university level. And then as a dean, I made discretionary decisions on the allocation below. However, the discretionary decisions were motivated by an understanding of cost, revenue, and cross subsidy that we educated across the units. So the rationale of the RCM was sort of something we used, but we used discretion to accommodate the extraordinary level of cross subsidy you often need in fields like we're associated with, particularly the design-oriented fields, where the nature of how we teach our, quote, technology, if you use it in economic terms, dictates that we have sort of a fairly heavy cost structure relative to the revenue we generate. So those two basic kind of models, RCM and incremental, are what you see. Every RCM is what we call a hybrid or modified RCM. Almost none are pure RCM. That is purely measuring the costs and purely measuring the revenue flow. The measurement of the cost and revenue flow is where you introduce the incentives. So where the university is going when they adopt these is they'll say, okay, we'll push a little more revenue in relative terms to units that have high retention rates, high graduation rates. Those might be factors. They might push a little bit more to those units that have high teaching of non-majors to reward getting outside your discipline. They're going to push money based on majors, so the money is going to follow the student. And if your enrollment is struggling, you're going to see less funding. And that is reflecting that tuition dependence of the institution. Here at Oregon State University, we're 70%, roughly 7 out of 10 of our education and general fund dollars are coming from tuition. And now Oregon's a bit on the vanguard on that, leader nationally in terms of the reduction in state support. But a lot of universities are headed this direction, and that's why you're seeing more of these RCM models. Let me finish my kind of opening comments here with just a couple additional points. Cross subsidies are really common. In fact, the whole university is built on cross subsidy. There is nothing wrong with cross subsidies. So what's happening in an RCM type context where all the money's coming in and the university is allocating out to colleges, say, and other administrative units based on estimates of cost and revenue generation at those levels, they're also allocating out, in effect, various cross subsidies. And that just reflects that some units have a low cost structure relative to revenue generation than other units. And that's the nature of things. The confusion around that is extreme. So it's very typical often in universities for colleges of engineering, for example, to imagine that they generate enormous resources for the university because of their high cost and their high research dollars. But in fact, if you value it correctly and really account for all the costs there, the net revenue generated by highly technical colleges like that is often very low and often negative. Where you're generating a lot of revenue is typically in your liberal arts and to some degree in your sciences, where you're teaching large classes, comparatively modest salaries relative to what you're paying in engineering and some other fields. And that's helping you support those higher cost disciplines. Planning's kind of an interesting one because in some colleges, in some circumstances, planning can actually be a very good net revenue generator. It can also be a net revenue loser, or one that requires a lot of cross subsidy. Traditionally, planning has been a graduate field that has been very generous in using tuition remission or graduate assistantships. And as a consequence, it's an expensive field. It also hasn't gotten into the undergraduate business, and it's been a bit slow, I think, to get in the online business pre-pandemic. And all those things are actually tough for the university to sustain. And that's kind of the pinch that you might be feeling as department heads. Some last points is some tips. Know your university's source of funds and know the trends. This is what's motivating a lot of decision making at the university level. You ought to know where's the money coming from, and what are the trends. And you really need to know about things like payments on behalf, which are things that the state is paying directly for the university that are not typically valued in some of the university data. Classic example, at the University of Illinois, the state pays the fringe benefits. They're completely off the university budget. It's an enormous component of the budget. The discretionary component that the university sees is what everybody imagines the state is spending. But in fact, if you're a legislator sitting in Springfield, you are realizing I got to pay all these benefits, and then I got to pay the discretionary flow. And I probably got to pay some capital spending. They're thinking of the whole. The faculty are thinking of a part. The faculty are imagining things are declining. The state's seeing the things grow. And thus, a lot of battle going on and kind of a view of the faculty that they're not being supported. In fact, in Illinois' case, even years of what felt like reduced budgets were generally stable budgets. What was happening is the spending was shifting from discretionary spending to benefits as benefit costs rose substantially. These are important things to understand because they get to the politics of budgeting, and they get to going back to my first point, your role as an educator of faculty as to how the finances within the institution work. So know your university's budget model and press for hard data. If you say to yourself, gosh, the data I have on my budget is not very good, you would be in very good company with just about everybody else. A lot of the data out there that we have on the financial side from universities is not very good. It's partly because our ERP systems are old, partly because we didn't build them with the mindset of thinking in RCM terms, where unit leaders are saying, let me worry about revenue and let me worry about cost. In the past, all unit leaders worried about was allocating cost. And once you get into kind of a situation where, okay, department head, find some creative ways to generate additional activity, generate new program, create revenue flow, you need different kinds of data. But our systems are lagging typically across higher education, getting you the data you need. Understand your level of cross subsidy and be prepared to defend it, but don't be crazy about it. We have 3 deans on the call or on the webinar this morning, and the deans are, in a difficult spot because they're trying to figure out how to balance different kinds of units within their colleges. And so in addition to understanding kind of the university level flow of funds and sources and that kind of thing, it's a good idea to think about the position your dean's in if you're a department head. What is the dean trying to balance? And what I would often argue as a dean is, I knew I was going to subsidize a field like dance. The question to me was not whether that was good or bad. We wanted a good dance program. We had to think about how we funded it. What was important to me was how much subsidy to provide to dance, because that had an impact on how much money we had to draw from a field like architecture, which at that time was helping us fund dance because they produced more revenue than cost. And so that's just a balancing act your dean is often playing. And as a department head, you're wise to think about, how can I help that? So I would often talk to our arts units, the theater, music, dance, and I would say, you know, are there some ways we can do some things more creatively to help on the revenue and cost front, which will help our units over here, city planning, architecture, landscape architecture. When I finally realized everybody was kind of getting it was a meeting we had where a couple of units brought in requests for funding, including the music school that wanted to hire a guitar faculty to deliver large guitar classes because students love guitar, and would have really helped our budget. And the School of Architecture said, please, let's give them the money to hire the guitar players, because the School of Architecture realized at the end of the day, if the overall revenue picture improved for the college, that meant good things across the units. That goes back again to that education point. If you can get folks to that point, we can move the needle a little bit better on some of the changes we need to take. Last point I will make, budgeting is ultimately strategy. That's all it is. And I think, you know, the hard part for department heads these days is you've got to be as much a strategic thinker as an administrator. And it used to be you administered and you just kind of, you know, you got tagged. I mean, under the old chair model, you got tagged, you have to be chair, you do it for 5 years, try to keep everybody reasonably happy and then go back to your regular job. That was a nice world. It didn't last very long. And so unit heads are now in a position where they really have to be more strategic in thinking about how are we going to adapt to a world where tuition is driving more and more of what we do. And if, for those of you in publics, if it makes you feel better, privates have been doing this for a long time. So we can figure it out, but it is a little bit more challenging. So those were my opening thoughts, and back to you, Cherie.
Thank you. I'm actually going to pass it off to Ms. Carissa.
Great. Thank you, Cherie. Thanks so much, Ed. We really appreciate it. This is great kind of foundation setting for the conversation that we want to have in the rest of the webinar. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carissa Slaughterback. Right now, I'm the Dean in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And we are pleased to welcome a couple of other great folks to the conversation. Ellen Bassett is here. She's the Dean in the College of Design at Georgia Tech. And Dawn Jordan is the Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland. So additional voices, additional budget systems, university systems, institutional structures to be able to reflect on. And I think that's one of the most important pieces I've picked up in various places I've been and trying to advance initiatives around a number of pieces is that context matters. And I think for you, especially emphasizing, again, what Ed said, a lot of budgeting is strategy. So really thinking about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, what are the tools that you have to get there, how do resources fit in. So I have a few questions just to kick us off, but I hope this is just a conversation among great leaders in our field to be able to jump in, share insights from their work, and also questions that are bubbling up. So I'll kick us off, but feel free to raise your hand, use the hand function, or throw things in the chat. That sounds great as well. So Dawn, Ellen, Ed, feel free to chime in. But one, how do budget models on your campuses, Dawn and Ellen, vary from what Ed shared related to Oregon State? And how does this change the budgeting strategy for you as deans? And especially how should planning programs and departments be thinking about strategy?
So I am the dean of a non-departmentalized school, and context matters. When you are a school, the budget comes directly to the dean. There are program chairs rather than department heads. And so each department is not going to have its own budget. It is going to make a request every year to the dean for that budget. Budgets here at Maryland are historic and incremental. Ed outlined incremental. I would say they are more historic than anything else. So there is an expectation about the amount of revenue that will be generated that does little more than cover the cost of offering the things that we do. And so, you know, every year I go through a process of budgeting with all the program directors and the units about what meets their needs and what new initiatives they'd like to have. We are not a butts and seats model. And so if I were to grow a program, that wouldn't necessarily come with more resources. I would have to make the case and ask the university to recognize the contribution. And I think that's critical. The point was made about strategy. Everything that we do when funds are limited is strategic. And so you look at the strategic plan and what the president and the provost are interested in, figure out how you fit within that and how you can bring new resources to the school, not just from the university, but from the legislature, of course, with permission from your president and provost, and from both philanthropic foundations and from private enterprise individuals.
So of course, the leaf blowers have decided to blow outside of my office right now. So I just thought, if you hear this weird noise, that's what they're doing. Like 3 of them simultaneously. I'll talk about 2 experiences because I've been at Georgia Tech since January. But prior to that, I was at Virginia. So both places, we actually made the transition from being incremental into an RCM model. And I have to say, both places have certain contexts that are the same. So both are very strong enrollment universities. So there's no issues of declining enrollments or worrying about that whatsoever. Both universities have relatively strong state support, but the system, it's a system at Georgia. So we are one of 26 institutions. So we have to like vie for attention from the Board of Regents and the legislature and that kind of thing. At Virginia, it was a single campus with a single board of what they called visitors. So in terms of what's happening at Georgia Tech right now, this transition, we're in a transition year. So we're moving from having had an incremental model where essentially last year we just came to the provost and said, okay, we assume we get our base budget and we want 3 more positions in a staff position and we need somebody to be a liaison to industry. And we gave them a wish list. And then just like any bargaining position, right? You go in with more than you think you're going to get and you somehow land in the middle, which is essentially what we did. And then the dean's role is to say, okay, so we got $700,000. What if I give 1 position to architecture, even though they asked for 3, and 1 position to planning? And so then you end up sort of doing this sort of allocation. What we're doing this year, which I think is going to be super fascinating to watch, is what we're calling a parallel process. So we're running the incremental model, but at the same time, we're doing, let's call it a second set of books. So they're going to say, how much, in fact, does the College of Design bring in the way of tuition? And at the same time, they're going to be doing sort of cost calculations. So what are you spending? Some of our biggest places of erratic spending are on short-term lecturers or adjuncts. For some reason, the pay scale is off the charts in architecture, and the planners are kind of in the middle, and the music faculty are incredibly cheap in how they pay their people, right? So looking at sort of those sort of things that are going on. But what we're going to hopefully know at that point is under an RCM, if we had done it this year, what would our tuition flows have been? And we're assuming we're basically going to come out in the red, right? That there's going to be a situation where we're not bringing in as much as we're sending out. Similar to what Ed said, I've got a school of music. It's very Georgia Tech because the degree is music technology. So we have laptop orchestra, for instance, okay? We have industrial design, architecture, building construction, and city planning. And so 3 of those are sort of either studio or performance-based. So they're very consumptive of space. We have an issue, and I would love to know how Ed thinks about this, of where the credit hours that we award for something. So say for an ensemble, it's a 1 credit hour class that somebody would pay for, but it's really 3 contact hours for the faculty. So there's this disjuncture between the kind of money that would flow into us and what it's actually costing us in terms of instruction. So again, I think it's true, the conversations that I've been having with the chairs of our schools who all get their individual budgets. And again, it's been incremental. I've basically inherited what they had from the years before, is about how can we increase the financial flows in, the revenues in, and the big options there are curricular. So we're looking at things like, could you do a huge World Cities class, city planners? Could you do a smart cities class, right? Can we get all those engineers to come over and be in a lecture hall where then instruction is relatively inexpensive, but the flows will be good. So we're looking for those kind of incentives. And then the discussion that will be had, and I don't know if you guys know Gusha Kaur, she's our chair, she came from Ohio State. What percentage does the school get and what percentage does the college get? Because the cross-subsidization issue within the units, I think, is really critical to address. I don't want my School of Music to be undermined, but they may not have the same opportunities to raise revenues as some of the other sort of programs within the college. So those are some first thoughts after listening to Provost Fazer talk.
Great. Thank you for that. And Ellen, we're in the same boat of running two models side by side, but also came from University of Minnesota, which was very much in the RCM or RCM-like space. So I'm enthusiastic about the change that we're making. I think one of the things that the RCM model does is it makes the flows much clearer. They're much easier to articulate, and I think you can understand the financial implications of decisions that you make. So right now, our graduate enrollment is a little bit down. We're looking at the tuition revenues that we might generate under the new RCM model that will be in. So we're looking very quickly at undergrad. And it's a conversation that's been going on for a couple of decades, but at this moment when we have a bit of extra faculty capacity that we could deploy, we have some other opportunities kind of with some institutional changes in the university, and we're jumping right into this space to say, how can we get a few hundred undergrads taking courses that are ours to be able to generate this tuition that we can use and now keep essentially paying the taxes, of course, to the university within this. But it's so much clearer how to work in the system and how to advance strategies that you have. I wonder for Ed, Dawn, Ellen, for planning programs and departments, what are recommendations that you have for directors and chairs related to working with their deans as a part of the budget process? How have you done this as deans or administrators? And what would you love to see among those that you're working with?
I'd say that it's not just the budget process, it is the relationship building process. So you shouldn't just be going to see your dean when you have a financial need or it's budget season. You should be meeting with them regularly to tell them all the good things that you're doing, and that your faculty are doing, and that your students are doing. You should come to them with issues that you have proposed solutions for. And, you should be talking to them about how you can be involved in generating revenue for your program. So asking, are there any incentives at the university for trying this other thing? Or how might I be a part of that? Or is there some other way I can work with the programs in the school or college to enliven the activities within, but also to raise our footprint in the school? Planning programs are invariably small. And we are great at partnering with folks. So I think coming with a very proactive, solution-oriented approach to a dean, cultivating a relationship so the dean comes to you with issues and opportunities is probably the sweet spot for that relationship.
So I have to say, and it may be very reflective of the fact that we're in this transition period, right? So we hired Deloitte to do the sort of benchmarking about an analysis of how RCM has worked elsewhere. How might it work well at a university like Georgia Tech, which is, truly dominated by technology, right? I mean, the big gorilla units are engineering and computing. And one of the things that has happened as a result of that is there's been a lot of process and a lot of discussion about even evaluating where our base budgets are right now. And so what I have had to ask of my chairs, and I think it's trying to tell them it's not me meddling, it's actually needing data, is getting data on things. So I made a reference earlier to the cost of instruction for short-term lecturers. We've been pulling HR data, absolutely pulling all that, trying to understand, because that has been autonomously decided how to pay by the chairs, to look at spaces where, we might be able to do cost containment, but also where we might get economies of scale. So I've been doing a lot of discussion about staffing. We are much more heavily staffed here compared to the University of Virginia, where I was before. A lot of it has to do with the complexities of being in a system. It takes something like 12 steps to hire a student, and a 12-step program is what it's going to send me to if it keeps up this way, because my God, it's so difficult to hire students. But it's because we have the veneer of USG on top of us. So we've been doing a lot of talking about our budgeting process, talking about our costs, talking about how we're making determinations. How do we do more efficient student recruitment? So maybe we only need one career educator instead of 3. And those kind of things to help with cost containment, with the idea that if we're more efficient, that frees up resources that can go elsewhere. And I do think what Ed said relative to, budget is ultimately strategy. It absolutely is. And the one strategy every chair I work with has is I want to hire more faculty. And the answer there is like, okay, I get it, but what are they going to teach? How's it going to build the program, and how are we going to afford it? And I think that how are we going to afford it is the critical thing that we start thinking about as we think about it as a sort of a broader unit. And so it's been very helpful. And I can't say that my chairs haven't been useful. They've really been sharing information, but because we have strong schools, it looks like I might be meddling in their backyard, and they don't like to necessarily see that.
The only point I'd add to those, which are really good, is maybe I'm surprised how many times department heads didn't come to me as when I was a dean with an investment plan kind of mindset. So picking up on both Dawn and Ellen's points, you can imagine. I mean, I almost always am willing to make an investment to put a unit in a place where it will, within a reasonable period of time, be stronger and help the collective. And often department heads will get into the mindset of, I can't really make those changes I need to make because I don't have the resources to hire the faculty to do the work, to do X, Y, Z. So this idea of being proactive and strategic can extend to asking for a kind of front-loaded investment, which you expect to generate a return. Now, what you have to do is be really legitimate about that. You've got to make the case to your dean that, this is the return that's going to happen over time. And if it doesn't realize, these are the kinds of clawbacks that you would be willing to support. But I've always been surprised at how many departments when I was a dean, and now colleges as I'm a provost, don't actually come to me in that kind of a mindset.
I'm glad you said that. I'm sorry, Carissa.
No, go ahead, Dawn.
I was going to say, I'm glad you said that, because this process you're asking department heads to go through with their deans is the very same process we used when we meet our provost. Whenever you have a new initiative, or we are putting something out on behalf of a school or a college, we go through the exact same investment plan. Here's the big, beautiful idea. Here's the revenue needed, and here's what we believe it will generate and the metrics we'll use to get there. So the kind of sell job we're asking you to do, we're an awful lot better at it if you've started that conversation with us.
That's great. Thanks, Dawn. Ed, just jumping back to Ellen's initial comment, she had asked about the contact hours and credits, and just sort of how that sort of small minutia fits really importantly into the ways that we think about budgets and using our resources, including faculty time. Just to make sure Ellen gets your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel your pain, Ellen. The schools of music are really challenging, and I know Georgia Tech is particularly unique. We had the same issue. I could think of 2 possible solutions. One's not so great, which is to rethink to actually rethink how those classes are measured in contact hours and credit hours. So we did do a little bit of that in our School of Music, in part because we realized that to some degree that practice within music schools of having credit hours associated with a lot of contact hours, unusually high contact hours, led to some failure to recognize the impact on students. And students are putting in a lot of hours. It's kind of a mindset that that's okay, that comes out of the conservatory history of schools of music. So you can kind of make some modifications there. I think the bigger solution is going to this view that really understand your cross subsidies. And then hopefully your university level people will be responsive to what you face in your particular unit. One thing we do at Oregon State, so we have the RCM based model, but we have this cross subsidy structure is something we call the Community Support Fund. And we're not trying to be Orwellian. I mean, it really is trying to explain what it is. And that's kind of balancing factor. So, in your case, I as provost might say, okay, I know this unique feature of music schools. And as a consequence, part of the subsidy that's going to the College of Architecture is, and you might have changed your name but anyway, your college is motivated by our understanding at the university level of the unique needs of music. But you can only do that if you've educated your provost. So that's hopefully the university won't tie you in knots in terms of really strictly adhering to the algorithm, and we'll have some forgiveness around the uniqueness of the college.
Yeah, I think we've tried really hard. And one other thing we did, and I don't know if you've experienced this in transitions you've been in, is with our conversations with Deloitte, I actually was really critical about our current base budgets and argued really strongly that especially post-COVID, we had significant cuts. So we were actually below, what they used as the base budget year was critical for us. But what has also happened is that we've had, unfulfilled or unfilled faculty lines, and we've been stealing from them and using them for other things. And so we seem to be doing our base mission okay, but in fact, it overlooks the fact that we're stealing from Peter to pay Paul or whatever. So I use the analogy of being on a diet and told Deloitte that essentially they had me on a 1,500 calorie diet, and I was surviving, but I wasn't doing really well. And if they wanted us to flourish and actually just be healthy, we needed to be 2,000 calories. And so we argued for all the money that should be in our base budget, it wasn't there. Thus far, they haven't given us that money. But my view on RCM is you got to come in as high as you possibly can with your starting year, because at least after that, if they're going to hold you harmless, which they did at Virginia as well as here, at least for a few years, you have some buffer as the whole process of tuition and figuring that out unfolds from the center.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the base, this is why RCMs are fundamentally historical / incremental at some level. I mean, they're based on a history, and that base is really, really important. So yeah, I would make a really strong case for your college.
Great. Thanks all. I saw Ryan Allen's hand raised. Ryan, do you want to jump in with a question? If you don't mind introducing yourself too.
I don't mind, but if there's more of if before you enter a Q&A, there are more things you wanted to get through.
Oh no, go ahead and I'll intersperse as appropriate. Okay,
but thank you, Krissa. I'm Ryan Allen. I'm a faculty member at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at Minnesota. Hi, Krissa, good to see you. And I'm director of our program and also serving as Associate Dean for Research at our school. So one insight and then one question. The insight I have is everything I see at Minnesota comports with what I've heard around the importance of tuition revenues. And the insight or the kind of reflection I have is that our incentive structure at a major research university is still set up to reward research rather than being an amazing teacher. And I wonder, maybe you could comment on ideas about how to start being more realistic about what we need to do in the classroom, given the importance of tuition revenues. The second thing is a lot of ideas that I hear about how to increase tuition revenues involve, accurately or not, stealing students from other programs, right? I would love to create an undergrad program, but political science and others at the university are less enthusiastic about that because they think that I'll just be taking their students. And I wonder how you think about that. I mean, how do we get more creative about expanding the pie rather than splitting up the pie?
I'd like to start with your question about teaching and how we recenter ourselves on that mission while trying to accomplish the level of research that we're expected to do. Universities across the country have moved to this 2 classes of faculty. So there are the teaching faculty that have teaching only appointments, and then there are the research faculty that have both teaching and research appointments. I think this is the model that we're using to accomplish that, but there's some real limitations of it that we experience all the time, which is the teaching class really does struggle with, longevity and whether or not they have contracts that will keep them at the university. They struggle with loads and course sizes. Last year, the University of Maryland tried to come up with a new workload policy, and it set the teaching load for tenure track faculty at 2.2, and then it set the teaching faculty at something like 4.4 or 5.4. It was huge. And while I suppose that is theoretically possible, it really does create a class system that's harmful. And it also makes it very difficult to accomplish some of the long-term structural governance challenges that we have, especially in small schools like mine. While I completely value the teaching faculty, for us, it becomes this constant question of what's the right load for faculty to teach? How do we credit it? Ellen, we're a school of architecture, right? So we have people teaching these giant studios that are 6 or 9 hours, and we're counting them as one class. And so there's real inequity in the system. And I don't have a solution to propose, but I would say that keeping the conversation active and helping the faculty, both classes, understand what they bring to the mission, and helping everybody understand that these units don't run without the people who participate in the ways they do is sort of the first step in making that part of the culture of a school or a college.
So let me just say that I'm going to talk about Virginia more than here, but when I was at Virginia, we did institute an academic general faculty cadre, right? And so they weren't, oh good Lord, teaching that much, but they were likely teaching 3.3, for instance, instead of 2.2. But what we did with our faculty council in the School of Architecture was we actually looked at how many credits do we need to deliver every year for all the degree programs we do, regardless of which department it was in. And we did a really back of the envelope, right? X number of credit hours to move the students through, X number of people teaching, everyone should be teaching this many credit hours. And what you would find as you looked more closely at how we were assigning people to teach was we were, and I'm going to sound like an economist, but we were incredibly inefficient in our teaching. So we'd have people teaching 6 students, right? One faculty member, 6 students. I'm like, that historic preservation class, it doesn't have to be offered every year. Let's save those students up and have 12 students in a classroom and teach it once every 2 years. And the idea there is you have to be able to map out your curriculum ahead, right? Because the student has to come in and be actively advised that that class won't be offered this semester, but it's offered then. So you have to count when to take it. But my objective, and the dean stopped me from doing it as chair, was to move the planning faculty to a 2-1. And the idea was within that 2-1 load, if you did one large sort of lecture, so Tim Beatley had these sort of enormous 500 student introduction to planning classes and 350 cities in nature with a, but then you had a seminar or you had your research class and you covered it. And we, argued endlessly that we could do it that way. And I still think it's a possibility that we could get down to 3-1s within planning if you have the commitment and sort of the cachet of a big class that can help with the tuition flows, but also, give somebody more time in a semester if they've got sufficient teaching assistant support. So here, I know Elora's on the call. I'm pretty sure city planning here is still 2-2. I would be completely supportive of efficiencies in teaching. But, it does take sufficient infrastructure to make sure the students are advised well and get the classes when they need them in order to graduate on time.
We are correcting for the small class size with interdisciplinary offerings as well. We are encouraging programs to open up their classes to others in the school. And this has worked pretty well as long as folks are willing to have stacked classes and to have undergraduates in graduate classes, even if they're doing something a little bit different. But that comes with a host of other challenges that people struggle with.
Yeah, I think the efficiencies we're talking about here are very great cumulatively across the university. And one thing more universities need to do is take those on as university-wide, the kinds of solutions that Don and Ellen are talking about. Because I've always believed too, that if we just allocated our teaching better and more thoughtfully, we would free up a lot of resources. And I have seen units do exactly what Ellen described, which is actually reduce their load by rationalizing teaching and then establishing a firm minimum. So, you know, instead of saying, okay, we're going to 2-1 and you can buy out a 2, or you can find various ways of getting out of 2, so you're actually at 1, everybody's at 2-1. And, you know, you can do things like that. Ryan, I think I'll just say from my standpoint, I believe we got to get away from talking about teaching loads. Notice we never talk about research loads. We talk about teaching loads, and then we talk about other things we'd rather do. And I do think that the world is headed to a place where the teaching is our fundamental reason for existence, even in research universities. And we've got to find a way to get back our sense that as professionals in a craft, our role as educators is the leading thing we do. And of course, we do research in order to be better educators. So that's a bigger conversation. But one small point about competition. The RCM approach generally should be opening up the opportunity for units to innovate in their curriculum and to some extent let the chips fall where they may. But we know in the politics of the institution that isn't always true. But what I would always encourage units is build creative programs and challenge others to explain the reasons why those programs don't have merit if there's demand and potential outcomes, both academic and career oriented for the students who would go through them. Challenge them to resist those programs. Because really, again, going back to this increasing consumer-oriented focus in higher ed, where students are going to be looking for those things that are of most value to them, and we're going to, I think, move toward more of a lifelong learning model for real. We need these kinds of new creative programs. And if what we're going to say is, well, we're going to try to drive students to political science, even though they don't want a political science major, that is a losing proposition for the institution as a whole. You cannot just drive students as easily as you might have been able to in the past. They are going to vote with their feet. So I would just keep pushing on that, and hopefully your university will support you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think one opportunity planning programs have, just by the nature of our discipline, our field, the ways that we work, is that in lots of ways, what we do, and especially what we can do with greater creativity and innovation, is accomplish some of those priorities that universities have. Engaged opportunities, interdisciplinary opportunities. These are things that come natural to us, less so to political scientists, I might argue. So thinking about ways that we're creating value added, something new, something different, something that layers on top of those traditional degrees. I was just having this conversation yesterday, laying the groundwork for the provost to intervene when political science tries to fight against our upcoming undergrad minors. And, you know, she and I were both agreeing that they can't be just competition. They need to be something that truly enhances the student's experience and aligns with priorities that the university has. So great questions and comments. Ellen, were you going to jump in? Otherwise, I'll go to Greg.
I just had one small example. Yeah. So, but it isn't planning oriented, but we have an industrial design program. And one thing it's really clear is that mechanical engineers really want to think about not just what they're designing, but the interface, you know, and all that. So we did what is perhaps unthinkable. We did summer teaching. And so we set up the entire minor that a student in an ME could knock off an industrial and design minor in the summer. So it's been a good cash cow, if we can say that, for ID, but it's almost 200, it's one of the biggest minors on the entire campus. And so thinking a little bit creatively like that is also an opportunity. I mean, I think, again, with planning, smart cities, climate change adaptation and infrastructure, like there's topics out there that I think students in poli-sci are hungry to take. So, but the issue is, can you offer it in ways that they can actually fulfill the whole minor? In some ways, summer is an opportunity, and then we went for it here.
That's a great idea. Let's let Greg jump in. Hi, Greg.
Hello, Greg Schrock, Portland State University. New in this role because of August. Excellent panel. My question is really about the point about transparency, and I really think that that's something that I think is a really critical issue, and it's something that it's always found vexing as a kind of rank and file faculty member. Ellen will appreciate this, me asking a school director or department head, do we have a budget in this unit? And the person responded, well, we don't really have a budget. We just ask the dean for what we need and they give us it or not. And that was not a satisfying answer for me at the time as a new assistant professor, and I don't think it's a satisfying answer for me now as the department head. But I wonder, what is the right way to be transparent about this? Because I think that there's a line between not giving any information or just saying like very high level overview of the budget, and like getting really granular and in the weeds on things, which I think sometimes can invite more in the weeds conversation than a bigger strategic conversation about where we want to go as a unit. And so, in your experience, what is that happy medium between, a need to know basis and gory details that is actually counterproductive?
So I have also worked at institutions where departments really didn't have a budget. Deans paid for faculty and staff, and there was a little tiny bit of money left over for initiatives and so forth, but really that's what it was. And these places that are not very forthcoming with their budgets may in fact not have much surplus budget to deal with. It is, faculty lines and staff lines that gobble up about 75 to 80% of the budget. And, that while it is public record, that's not the part of the budget that the dean is going to show, because that is going to open up a terrible conversation about equity. I mean, one of the first things I did when I came here as dean is to do a complete audit of all the staff salaries in the school, because I knew that I had equity issues. I got 16 emails before I started, right? So that was where I knew I needed to start. But beyond that, I can show how IT and communications and others spend. I can show the discretionary monies that programs have that they decide how to use, whether it's through graduate assistance or other types of activities. But in some places, if you're feeling like there's not much budget transparency, it may just be that there is not a lot of discretionary budget. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be transparency about that too. But I know a lot of folks see this as like some secret dean trick to keep people from knowing what's what. But the reality, the what is that there's just not that much extra.
So I came into this job out of faculty governance, so out of the faculty senate and chair and that kind of thing. And so I have always been a great believer in budgetary transparency, but then I'm confronted with, my God, this school gets this much money for its general fund and this school gets this much. And because I don't understand why, going back to the historic part of it, why is architecture's general operating money so much vastly bigger than ID when ID has virtually the same enrollments and is still a studio class, structure? So part of what I've been doing is trying to understand the allocations and the justifications by looking at past expenditures, right? I mean, a very important thing to do. But I think at least to go back to, that the chairs have to play a role in educating the faculty of X amount of our money comes from state funds, so much is from endowment. There's so much discretionary money built into anyone's budget. I think that's very important. For me, I have to say that the budget I used to receive at Virginia was essentially, here's the faculty salaries, here's some money for professional development, which means you can go to a conference faculty member, and here's, $10,000 discretionary money chair. And that was it. That's what I got, right? But things that we didn't get to learn about that would be really helpful was the endowment at the University of Virginia is enormous. And there were lots of tagged money for certain departments. And we discovered later was that the dean had been actually using money that was targeted for, say, architectural history and using it for students in architecture. And you can imagine that was her downfall. So I do think that there's a certain amount of transparency you've really got to have, because if you, as a dean, at least irritate your faculty, they're going to go around you and go to the provost and start complaining. And so I think, but it's a little bit of a fine line, right? I'm not willing to talk about the budget completely openly because as right now, I don't even have a complete understanding of how the allocations went in the past. So I'm still in a learning curve there. And you did the transition to RCM at Portland State, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? Yeah, so you should be having some of this data. I just don't know what's been going on.
But we have the data, that's not an issue.
It's one thing to have data, it's another thing to analyze it, right? So
yeah, I think Ellen, I think you're being really smart, being careful about when you reveal it, so you know the reasons. I'm in favor of transparency. I have evolved my thinking over this. I used to be kind of radical transparency. Let's make it all available. Doing as Ellen said, first understanding why it is what it is, but then being willing to provoke the kinds of unhappiness that occur when units discover that one is very well resourced, one is not. And I've noticed there are kind of two dynamics. There's that problem, and then there's, for those units that are highly subsidized, they don't really like to be revealed, and you have to spend some time. They think of it as a revelation, like, oh, now now everyone thinks we're the needy with the handout, and you have to do a lot of work to say, look, this is just a nature of how you work. And as a dean or as a provost or whatever, you have to constantly reassure the units that get that subsidy that there's value in that, right? Depending, right, on how much it is. Here's the thought you might think about. Legibility is important to transparency. And sometimes, at OSU, you can dig through all our budget models. You can see our spreadsheets and how we allocate. You can check the algorithms behind them. And our budget officer goes around, and does 30 different plus sessions across the university. That's all very transparent, but I have had the sense that sometimes we give so much information in our intent to be straight up and transparent that it actually is confusing to people. And that's actually not transparency. We don't mean it to be confusing. So I think as a department head, you want to strike a balance between, you want to provide the kind of transparency that helps people understand the strategic decisions you're making. If you're getting so far in the weeds with the detail that higher level questions about why we decided to invest here and not there get submerged under lots of noise, you're not actually being transparent. You may mean to be. So I think there is this kind of happy medium, and where I would ground it is, what's the kind of information that helps you, if you're a dean, have your departments or programs have good conversations about strategy, or if you're a department head, the kind of information that helps you understand how you fit in the larger college whole, and kind of press your dean for that level of information.
Great. I saw Arlie take off his mute. So do you want to jump in with a question?
Oh, funny. I don't
Maybe it was
remember doing that.
accidental.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, my brain's going, but no,
Yeah.
really appreciated Greg's question. And yeah, I guess if I were to formulate a follow-up to that, and Ed, I think you just touched on it, is the level of transparency that is needed to really be, to have faculty be partners in the conversation around strategy. And I think in follow-up to what Greg was asking about, and maybe this is a conversation among the chairs, or this is something that could go into a later training, but are there actual tools, are there examples of, a very simple sort of budget summary that gives faculty enough information to be able to really engage in these conversations? Because I think that's where I see a real disconnect sometimes with our faculty and administration, is when we're being asked to look at different models of growth, when we're being asked to consider taking on different teaching assignments, we just don't know enough to know. And I still, as a new chair, don't know enough to really know what the outcome of that's going to be, and why, how we can get people on board with some of these changes that will have positive impacts, as many of you have mentioned.
Can I just make two quick comments? One, just Arlie, I know that in our transition to an RCM model, we're working very hard on doing dashboards. And so Workday Analytics is something that's really being rolled out. And there's all this sort of continuous process of what's useful information for whom. So I have my Dean's dashboard that's kind of in the making. And then at the school level, there's a bunch of discussions about that as well. So trying to figure out the right metrics and can we get them calculated? I want to talk just about the subsidized units question and the sensitivity there. I know that, one of the big questions is to find out whether in fact you're a subsidized unit. We had a very small architectural history department at the University of Virginia, and it kept getting its faculty cut because the rationale from the dean was they weren't getting enough majors or graduate students to justify more faculty. But at the same time, they were doing these huge service courses, right? The history of architecture 1 and 2, there were 250 some students, but it was all architecture students or landscape students or architectural history students. So it wasn't bringing outside money in. And the trick with RCM, right, is everybody wants to get, Ed, you haven't talked about the split in terms of tuition. We did a 75-25, right? Which meant that if you offered the class, you got 75% of the tuition dollars, and the origin unit of the student got 25%. So of course you want to get students from global development or something to come over to take your class. But the argument with architectural history was that they were only teaching within the School of Architecture. They weren't really bringing any new money. So they were being double hit in a bad way, but they were doing huge service courses. So I think it's important to also articulate, if you have a really important core course that teaches across a curriculum in a school or a unit, that is something you're doing, and that needs to be, recognized very strongly as an important thing.
Can I ask a question then? So do you have best practices for giving credit for these interdisciplinary contributions, or tagging revenue that comes in from them and sharing it appropriately?
I don't know of best practice, Dawn. I think that's a key strategic question for the university, how much they want to encourage that cross major teaching, or put the emphasis on the integrity of the major or the unit because it has a lot of majors. And I couldn't, there may be out there, but I don't know of anybody who said, okay, this is the right split. I think that's an institutional decision.
Ellen, you brought up and you mentioned endowments in one of the comments that you shared, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, obviously fundraising is a big part of the role of deans, provosts are involved in it as well, but as you think about planning programs in particular that you work with in your schools, how do you see program directors as partners in that work? whether providing information, collaborating, advancing strategies. Just wondering how we think about that as we look to grow our budgets or attract resources that might be able to support key initiatives.
Yeah, interesting. I just had my Dean's Advisory Board meeting last night and they were like, I'm like, God, this is a really big board. There's like 35 people. Why have we made it so huge? But we needed to have representation from every school. We had been very architecture heavy in the past. I think one thing that did really impress me being in Virginia was it was a fundraising machine. Like they have their act together and they invest heavily in it. So when I was coming here, I said to the provost, I've got a development officer. At Virginia, they'd have 5, right? So investing in development in order to move it is a very important part. But I certainly have seen that for me, even when I was chair, but also as dean, the best people to sell a program and articulate what's exciting and is going on and why somebody would want to maybe endow a professorship or in fellowships or things like that are the chairs, right? They really know the programs inside out. They can really articulate it really importantly. And so I think we used to do these road shows, and I'm assuming this is relatively common, go to New York and bring the chair and a faculty member who's doing great stuff. And so to engage with the alumni base to let them know what our needs are. We're in the middle of a capital campaign, just launching it. And so I fully anticipate being out there with the chairs of the departments or schools as partners. But one thing that I have to say is that endowments are used very differently here than they are at Virginia. So I can't get, say, a $3 million gift and have a fully endowed professorship. You have to have a state line. They only just get the revenue as fund money, let's say. So but whereas Virginia, you could do 100% hire if you got a big endowment, you could actually hire somebody as essentially private money. And that's the rules for endowments, I think, are worth for people to understand as well as they go out into this kind of fundraising world.
Other thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Other questions? Oh, Ed,
just
go
I was
ahead.
going to add, a very high share of the fundraising that universities are doing are driven by the largest gifts. And so I would say back when I was a department head and dean, I probably would have put more emphasis on fundraising at those levels than I would now. And what I mean by that is, it's probably not always my observation. If you're really going to drive fundraising, you've got to really concentrate at the high gift levels, especially for public universities that don't have the kinds of infrastructure that a University of Virginia, well, Virginia is public, but some schools just have done more and they have bigger infrastructures. So at OSU, we focus very heavily on the principal gift level, $1 million and above. We'll also concentrate on major gifts. And we've been able to outperform our size because of that. And so the department head's role is often the cultivation, engage, bring people on board, but don't feel like you have to go ask them for $1,000. I mean, you spend a lot of time getting small money when you're a department head. You're almost better off, and the institution's better off if you build a relationship and you pass that relationship on effectively to the next department head. Your dean then is going to go out and make asks that are at a bigger scale, that are likely to close deals better than department level and program level people. And then your chancellor or your president for the really big stuff. Your provosts actually are more in the background. So I kind of have evolved my thinking in being a little concerned sometimes that department heads maybe feel a little too much pressure to somehow raise money, spin their wheels. And I'd rather they think about just good engagement of their alumni and others that are friends of the unit.
I like this notion of the department head constantly communicating with the development officer and with the dean, because the dean and the development officer need a big, beautiful vision to sell. And that can't be their own. It has to be the vision of the faculty and the vision of the programs. So there's a place for it without having to be on the road. One of the things I've realized is the power of past department heads And I think Ed's comment about transitioning the information and the friendships to the next program head are really critical. One of the best programs in our department heads in our planning program was department head 2 or 3 times ago. And he still maintains a group of students that he gets together with on a quarterly basis. They get together on Zoom and so forth. None of us have access to that networks because he's retired unless he lets us in on it. So, you know, creating these relationships that transition over time are critical because lots of us are term limited too. You know, at the very longest, I will sit in my chair for 10 years, maybe 5 if the faculty aren't particularly happy with me at some point. And so we can get a lot accomplished in 10 years, but a lot of the folks I meet aren't going to be ready to give until the 11th year. And what happens when the new dean comes in or the new program heads come in along the way? It's all about friend raising, but you've got to make sure that there's a new friend waiting in the wings.
Yeah, I'd really like to see department heads, their quote metrics and philanthropy to be on engagement, not in dollars raised. And as department heads, you will be frustrated from time to time. Like you'll want the development people to go out and ask for a $10,000 gift and you'll have trouble getting their attention. And that will be frustrating. They're making a very practical calculation in the allocation of their time. And they want to go after 10, 20, 50, $100 million gifts. And actually from the institution standpoint, those gifts move the needle so much more. That's wise action on their part. So be prepared for that. And I think Don's kind of framing of this is where I would land too.
Yeah, that's great. I think I love framing it with that focus on engagement. I mean, the extent to which you're inviting alumni in to be guest speakers, serve on panels, inviting them to events that are department or program specific, surveying alums and gathering their feedback to inform your curriculum. All of that is about sort of sustaining and nurturing that relationship, which is that foundation of attachment to the place. And it's also serving them. And, you know, we have the sort of instrumental goal of raising more money from them, but there's so much that we get from engaging our alumni, regardless of whether it ultimately turns into $1 million gift. So I think thinking about the unique role that programs, chairs, departments can play in that space, that sets up things that might happen at a higher level eventually. And if not, there's still great benefits that are gained from it. We probably have time for maybe one more question if anyone has something they want to add. Anyone? Last comments from Ed, Dawn, Ellen?
Carissa, you put a really good question on the list, which was questions chairs should be asking their deans.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I really liked that because obviously we've talked about a lot of these and questions I would ask in your mind, you know, Dawn, what are the successes of our program this year? What really attracted your attention? And what would you like to see us doing more or less of? And what happens to the unspent fund? What if I don't spend my budget all the way down? Does the school get that? Does it go back to the university? Can I carry it forward? How will budget cuts be managed? I mean, we're talking about the revenue generation and the new programs and models, but in reality, many of us face budget cuts. And so the question for the dean is, when that happens, is that a uniform across the school, or is it going to be strategic in some ways? And those are the kinds of questions that you should always be asking and trying to figure out what the baseline is so that you can make a projection for the next year and for the 5 years of your term.
Other thoughts on that question of questions that chairs should be asking their dean? I think one thing I would throw in on that one is asking for information about what the dean is hearing from the broader university. What are priorities? I mean, information is typically shared around university strategic plans and some priorities. But I think to have a more focused conversation to understand what are the pushes or pressures that the dean is feeling? What are incentives that the dean is responding to? And how can a department or a program fit into that? I think that's an incredible opportunity. I think it helps our universities work better by having that conversation that happens across all of those levels. So I would definitely ask for more information about that. Anything else?
Marissa, that was my question
Oh, okay.
that I was going to ask. And so my hand is now down, but thank
Oh,
you
okay.
for
Sorry, I missed you.
putting that out there.
Yeah.
Having us better understand how we fit into the larger picture and what is that picture before it gets published, so that we can strategically set it up so that once it's out there, then we're right in line.
Great. All right. Anything else from anyone? Or otherwise, I'll turn it back to Sherry to close us out as committee chair. Thank you, everyone. It was great.
All right, and definitely thank you all. We appreciate your time. Before we go, I just want to give a little shout out to Elora Raymond, who put this together. She's been quiet on the background, but she's also a member of the Academy, and just really identifying speakers, reaching out, putting the questions together. And if there's a question that any of you have did not get answered, feel free to reach out to any of us, send us an email. Again, we're going to put this online, and then there'll be a series of frequently asked questions that will also be attached to this, so that you can always go back to it, and we will look at updating it as the years go by. Look forward to having some additional emails from us. Really, as we go into the beginning of the year, there'll be several more of these webinars, again, leading into the Administrators Conference. And so the Administrators Conference will be face-to-face, but we also want to be able to provide information online, because we can't, as most of our budgets are being cut, unable to do a series of meetings face-to-face. And so we have found that this is probably the best hybrid model, is a lot of online, culminating in the Administrators Conference in the spring. So with that being said, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you all for attending. Have a great day and have a great weekend.